Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone to what I think is going to be a very informative and enlightening evening. This event was oversubscribed weeks in advance and has got a waiting list of 50 still as of today, so obviously energy is a big issue. So what's the big deal about energy? Here we are in Australia, we've got $200 billion worth of energy investment projects sanctioned at the moment, whether they be coal mining or gas production and associated infrastructure, and we even have a uranium production increase under consideration for investment. So it's a huge economic driver. A lot of this new energy is going to be exported. So already we're the #1 exporter of coal in the world, we're the #3 exporter of uranium, and we're the #4 exporter of LNG. And with these new projects that are sanctioned and some that are planned, it's even possible, and it's been forecast, that we might be the biggest exporter of all three of those commodities within the next decade or two. Of course, all of these resources are finite, and there'll come a time when they when production begins to decline, and ultimately we actually run out. So while there is an important economic driver in developing these natural resources, and it's a huge economic benefit to the country, we just need to think about the context. So if we look at our electricity situation, we generate nearly about 3/4 of our power from coal, and yet we are the world's biggest exporter. We generate a bunch of it with natural gas, and we export a lot of that. We only generate about 8% from renewable resources, and nothing from nuclear. Electricity demand grows, although as we become less competitive in recent times, we're starting to see some of our energy-intensive manufacturing decline. So, for example, aluminium smelters are starting to look marginal in this country. So while our demand is growing due to population and economic development and so forth, a lot of it's in the peak, and that's exacerbated by rooftop solar installations and things like that. So going forward, we're facing a very interesting time in relation to electricity and energy generally. At the same time as prices are rising and consumers like you have this demand that we should have cheap energy and cheap electricity, but they are rising. And we overlay that in this context of the climate risk, where people are more and more concerned about CO2, prices are rising, but the market is such that it's very difficult to justify new investment in generation. So the future is very, very sensitive right now. If we are to meet our electricity demands, the Commonwealth Government predicts we're going to spend $80 billion on new generation capacity over the next 2 decades, and another 120 or so in transmission and distribution. So that's $80 billion in the next 2 decades on new generation capacity. Just to put that in context, in the last decade, when what I would say the economic climate was a lot better for investment, we spent 12. Now we're going to spend 80 in the next 2 decades. As we spend this $80 billion, what we need to ask ourselves is, what is the right energy mix? So we've got this abundance of resources, of natural resources, which are finite, they're non-renewable. We've got renewable resources which clearly have to play a part in this picture in the future. But to me right now, they look some time away from being able to supply us with reliable, price competitive electricity on a continuous basis. So we really are in a dilemma. And that dilemma is also partly driven by this export of our non-renewable resources. We need to do, well, we think we need to do that for economic development of the country. The boom in mining right now, a lot of it about energy, is driving the economic health of this country. But what does that mean for energy security and climate change, which are problems for the next generation? So this whole balance between energy security, climate change and economic development is, I think, a really, really complex and interesting question for Australia. In today's forum, I think we've got 3 very distinguished people who are from various backgrounds in energy, who will give us, I think, different insights and perspectives. Each of them is going to talk for 15 minutes. I have a bit of a picture on what they're going to talk about, but when I invited them, I wasn't sure. So, well, with the exception of one, I was pretty confident where he would be coming from. After that, we'll open it up to questions and we'll invite questions from the floor. The first person who's going to speak to us is Professor Peter Hartley. Peter's the George and Cynthia Mitchell Chair and a Professor of Economics at Rice University in Houston. He's also the Rice Scholar for Economics in the Baker Institute, which is hosted at Rice. He's worked for more than 25 years in economics, energy economics if you like. Originally in electricity, but since that in natural gas, coal, oil, nuclear and renewable energy. He's actually an Australian originally. I think he's been domiciled in the Houston area for about 30 years, but Mum and Dad live in Lismore, so we're lucky we get him tonight because he was visiting Mum and Dad. But in his early days, he was heavily involved in advising the Victorian government, for example, on reform and privatisation of the Victorian electricity sector. He worked in the Prime Minister's Department in economics, and apart from energy economics, he's well known for his work in banking and international finance. I think degree in mathematics from ANU, PhD in economics from University of Chicago. Good. After Peter, we're going to hear from Barry Jones. Barry is the General Manager Policy and Membership at Global CCS Institute, so CCS being Carbon Capture and Storage. He has overall responsibility for this Global Institute's position on policy, on monitoring the installations of CCS around the world and social engagement for that sort of technology. CCS, I think we will see, is applicable to both coal and gas as a potential technology to give us low emissions electricity from those industries. He has a background in policy and has worked in a range of government agencies from energy and resources, climate change and tourism. And then finally we'll hear from Barry Murphy. Barry is the former Chairman and Managing Director of Caltex Australia, Chairman of Natural Fuels Australia Limited, Foundation Chairman of Biofuels Association of Australia. Recently he stepped down after 10 years as the Chairman of the Australian Rail Track Corporation. He's a chemical engineer and an alumnus of UQ, as I am, in chemical engineering. And he's had an enormous amount of experience all the way from oil, petrochemicals, airport, rail, algae to biofuels, etc. He's currently an advisor to the Algae Fuels Consortium, which involves the South Australian Research and Development Institute, CSIRO and Flinders University. I think he retired from Caltex, but when I look at the list of things you do, you're not a very good example to us budding retirees one day.
Well, they're not paying me anymore.
So I think you'll agree the quality of these speakers to help us sort of tackle this question is going to be tremendous. So it's back to the question, what's the best technology mix, what's the best primary energy mix as we go forth and invest in Australia's energy future? How do we juggle those economic benefits of developing the non-renewable resources and exporting them versus this energy security and climate change challenge which we have to think about for our future generations? I think enough from me, and I'd love to hand over to Peter to start us off.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Chris. And I'm going to actually, I spoke earlier today at the university about the whole issue of the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. And I could have said a lot about world trade in natural gas and some of the other questions that Chris raised. But what I really want to focus on is to sort of, I'm going to set the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit, I guess, relative to what the other speakers are going to say. And I'm going to basically argue that I don't really think climate policy is a reason why we want to accelerate the end of fossil fuel use. And particularly, I want to argue that it doesn't really make a lot of sense for Australia to be leading the way in that issue. So one of the most discussed policy issues in energy economics is whether concern about climate change requires us to actually intervene to reduce fossil fuel use. And I'm going to discuss some general economic principles relevant to that, and then argue that natural gas, and unconventional natural gas resources in particular, have given us a new opportunity to limit CO2 accumulation while we develop these alternative energy technologies, which we need down the track, but we need to make sure they're cost competitive. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about climate policy. So what's the basis for the concern? CO2 emissions from fossil fuel will increase surface temperatures and have other effects on climates, but the size, nature and geographic distribution of those effects are very uncertain. So what can we do to respond to this threat? Policy respond to the threat can be placed into 5 categories. The first one is reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, from burning fossil fuels, and that's the one that people talk about. But it's not the only policy. There are lots of other alternatives. The reason being that CO2 is actually not directly toxic as a gas, at least not at the sort of levels we're talking about, unlike a lot of conventional pollutants. So it gives you lots of other alternative policies. Another alternative, of course, is even if you're going to worry about the build-up of CO2 in the atmosphere in the short run, you can also sequester CO2, and one of the other speakers is going to talk about that in more detail. Preferably, though, if you're going to sequester it, you'd like to do so via methods that yield other benefits. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Third option you can do is introduce people have sort of spoken about various kinds of geoengineering projects that would offset the warming effects of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. I'll talk a little bit about that third category. But there are also 2 other categories of policies that people don't discuss very often. Fourth one is limiting the chance or magnitude of harmful effects from climate change. And the 5th one is taking measures to cope better with damaging weather events after they occur. What's the problem with forced switch in energy sources away from fossil fuels? So as I said, eventually fossil fuels will be replaced because depletion is going to raise their cost, and the sort of cost of the renewables will become competitive. Actually, there's a joke from the Saudi Arabian oil minister who commented one time, we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We left the Stone Age because better technologies came along. So eventually, we'll leave the fossil fuel age when better technologies come along. The problem is alternative energy sources currently have much higher capital plus operating costs. I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a moment. They also suffer from other problems, including frequent unavailability, extreme short-term, so one problem you might have, so for example we have, it turns out Texas is the biggest wind generation state in the United States, and one of the big problems is the high demand for electricity occurs in the summertime when you have high pressure systems over Texas. When you have high pressure systems over Texas you have no wind. So it doesn't really help a whole lot there. Extreme short-term variability, turns out actually that the production of power over the range where you can actually generate power from wind turbine goes as the cube of the wind speed. What that means is if you have a change in wind speed by, let's say it's going from 10 metres per second to 9 metres per second, or 10% change in wind speed, you get like a 30% change in power output. So you have very extreme fluctuations in the power supply, and that limits the ability to put more and more of that kind of generating capacity on the system. Another problem is the inability to schedule the time of supply. You'd like to have the supply when the demand's at its peak. You can't guarantee that. Remoteness from markets. One problem we've got with a lot of these renewable sources is that they're a long way from markets. In the case of Texas, for example, the wind generation's in West Texas, the demand's in the east. They're having to spend a huge amount of money on transmission lines to get the power from the west to the east. The transmission lines are only used about 25% capacity. So it's very, very expensive. Another problem with a lot of the renewables, they have low energy density. You think about transport applications, you're carting your energy source with you. What you want is high energy content per unit of weight and high energy content per unit of volume. It turns out gasoline has amongst the highest, diesel is probably the highest of the hydrocarbon fuels. One time I was talking to a chemist who joked if we didn't have gasoline we ought to invent it. Now R&D might sort of alleviate some of these problems in time, but at the moment they're considerable problems. In addition, large amounts of otherwise productive capital would have to be replaced, leaving fewer resources for consumption and for other investments. What about, so one alternative to that, as I mentioned, the second alternative is sequestration and geoengineering. Now, one thing you can do, again in Texas, they use CO2 for secondary oil recovery, but you know, it's only limited and it only sequesters the CO2 for a small amount of time. If you want to bury it permanently, it's much more expensive at the moment. You know, not really a competitive alternative, although I know the speaker might have a different position on that. And also these geoengineering projects to increase the reflection of incoming solar radiation also have been proposed, but again are very expensive and unproven. Now plants sequester CO2, so one alternative is you can have forestation. And people have proposed, for example, producing charcoal and burying it, which actually improves soil quality as well, but again, not really practical on a large scale yet. Biofuels actually recycle the CO2, but are currently very expensive. They compete with food production and actually have their own environmental problems. So one problem in the United States is with the production of corn ethanol, you get this very heavy fertiliser load in the Mississippi system. The extra fertiliser in the Gulf of Mexico causes dead zones where the oxygen is taken out of the water. Another alternative is adapting to climate change, as I mentioned. So policies or adaptations can reduce the likelihood of harm from these weather events. So examples will be you build levees or dikes, depopulate low-lying areas, those things can reduce flood damage. You can improve building materials, more stringent building codes can lessen the damage from strong winds. New crops, changes in the location of agricultural activities can offset climate change effects and enhance direct benefits of CO2 for agriculture. And better forecasts can reduce the costs of extreme weather. On top of that, many policies, including improved civil defence measures, can help you respond better to disasters. So, for example, Hurricane Katrina was not really a very major hurricane in the US history, only about the fifth largest, but its damage was so great because the civil defence response was so terrible. And a lot of these measures actually would be useful for responding to other emergencies, like earthquakes, terrorist attacks, and so on, which actually raises what economists call their benefit to cost ratio, okay, because you can use it for more things than just weather events, which makes them much more efficient investment of your funds than something that's focused only on climate. So basically what I'm saying is that we're going to transition from fossil fuels eventually, just like we transitioned from the Stone Age. How costly would it be to run a business as usual scenario where we use fossil fuels in the meantime and then transition as the costs become competitive? So the first thing is not all the effects of CO2 on climates will be harmful, and certainly not in all places. So a little bit of warming is going to be great for growing crops in Canada and Siberia and parts of Russia, Eastern Europe and so on, Poland, some of the grain baskets of the world. CO2 is, as I mentioned, non-toxic, and since it's food for plants, it actually yields direct benefits for agriculture and ecosystems. So crops grow a lot faster, stronger, more disease-resistant, more drought-resistant, and so on in higher levels of CO2. And these are experiments that have been done, thousands of them. Also applies actually to natural CO2 seeps. So people have looked at the growth of plants around natural CO2 seeps. Third point is climate is always changing, always has and always will. There are natural cycles. And as a result of many of these natural and anthropogenic effects other than CO2, climate will continue to change. So at best, what you're doing when you control CO2 is you're tackling just one source of climate change. The larger the number of sources of climate change, the larger the non-CO2 effects on climate, and the greater the geographic variability, the lower the expected benefit from controlling CO2, and the better, the more optimal it is to focus on some of these adaptation and remediation strategies. Now, I mentioned one problem with renewables is the cost. So what I have here is representative costs, and this is sort of, before you take account of the other features of wind generation, even as straight cost, so this is based on Energy Information Administration data from the United States. So for onshore wind, basically 12.48 cents levelised cost per kilowatt hour, compared with 6.38, 5.25 for natural gas. That's natural gas combined generation at 2009 prices. At today's prices, which are sort of like half this in the United States, natural gas is much more efficient. So you're actually paying quite an economic penalty to move to these sources in today's economic and climate. Natural gas has a big advantage relative to other fossil fuels, has much lower conventional pollutants. So what I've done here, this is carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulates, formaldehyde and mercury. Red bars are natural gas, blue is oil and the green is coal. You can see that in all cases except formaldehyde, natural gas produces much less conventional pollutants. Actually, when it comes to CO2, the other point of my story here is that in the short run we're going to transition, the fuel system is going to transition to using a lot more natural gas. What I've plotted along here is worldwide use of energy from fossil fuels, and on the vertical axis we've got the CO2 production from burning fossil fuels. And these are just numbers from about the last, how many points I've got in here, 20 years, 20 or 30 years. And what you can see from the slopes of these lines is that CO2 per unit of energy produced is lowest for natural gas, then for oil, and finally for coal. Notice that these triangles are very spread out. What this is the growth in energy production in China from coal. So as in recent years, as you're producing more and more energy in China using coal, we've seen a big increase in energy from coal production. But the other thing you see here is that as the fossil fuel system transitions from coal to natural gas, and to some extent also as we go from oil to natural gas, for example using electric vehicles, we're going to be producing less CO2 as well in the short run. The other big factor in natural gas is that we've had tremendous technological change, in particular with unconventional natural gas. This is a map of the shale gas plays in North America. Been a huge increase in supply of natural gas based on unconventional. And a recent study from the Energy Information Administration also has tracked this worldwide. What we've done is we've looked at the cost of exploiting unconventional gas in the United States, estimated those costs based on geology, also looked at the data from all these other continents, and basically from technically recoverable resource, we've got over 6,600 trillion cubic feet unconventional natural gas estimated recoverable worldwide. And you'll notice actually that 396 is basically Australia, but in North America you've got 1,931. Critical thing about that is that this new source of natural gas has really made a huge difference to energy security in North America. Only 10 years ago everyone was talking about the United States becoming one of the biggest natural gas importers in the world. As a result of the shale gas, they're now talking about the United States exporting natural gas, maybe for the short term. But what happens is if you took away the shale gas, who would be the big winners? The big winners would be Iran, Venezuela and Russia, hardly friends of the United States. So shale gas actually has tremendous energy security implications for the Western world. Implications for Australia, as was mentioned, Australia has substantial resources of conventional gas, coal seam gas and shale gas relative to its projected demand. Exploiting these resources will assure our medium-term energy security, bring substantial economic benefits to Australia and the region, help reduce actually worldwide CO2 emissions as you help Asian countries with huge populations, huge growing energy demands, transition from coal to natural gas. And in the meantime, it's the best strategy for dealing with climate change involves improved adaptations and responses to harmful weather events, no matter what the causes, while accepting the benefits that also come from extra CO2, including the direct fertiliser benefits for agriculture, as I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Does work. Well, good evening, and Chris, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. As Chris said, I'm from the Global CCS Institute, which probably doesn't mean anything to almost everybody in the room, but basically the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute is an Australian headquartered organisation. Our mission is to help contribute to the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular global carbon dioxide emissions, by advocating for carbon capture and storage, the technology that, as Peter said, is intended to permanently sequester carbon dioxide underground. And I'll explain a little bit more about what the technology involves at one stage through my talk. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is not just CCS, it's also putting CCS in the context of why it's required. And one of the major reasons CCS is going to be required, we think, is the importance of coal in the world energy situation. So what I'll be talking about is the importance of coal, both for Australia and for the world, putting it in context, talking a little bit about where coal fits in both the world energy future and Australia's energy future, talk about how you might deal with those growing emissions from coal, in particular through CCS, and then finish off by explaining a little bit more about what CCS involves and how the current status of CCS is panning out around the world. So, as Chris has already said, coal is an important fuel both in Australia and around the world. And as Chris said, coal accounts for about 3/4 of Australia's electricity generation. And while the use of natural gas and the use of renewables is growing fairly fast, they're growing from a much lower base. So in Australia, coal is going to be with us for a long time to come at fairly major quantities for our electricity generation in particular, but not just for electricity generation. It is also used for other things as well. And it's not just the consumption of coal domestically that makes coal an important thing for Australia's energy future. So this is a chart of Australia's coal consumption, production and exports for the past few years and into the future. Our consumption is the little green bars that you might be able to see right down the bottom. Australia's consumption of coal is basically dwarfed by our exports, which are the blue bars. And those exports have been growing rapidly in the past few years, and on the latest government projections are projected to continue to increase at a reasonably rapid rate into the future. And I should say that these projections are based on there being action taken to address climate change both in Australia and globally. So this takes into account the fact that Australia's taking action, which is why there's not much growth in the consumption figures, but also takes into account that there is going to be action to address climate change elsewhere, which is why the growth rate is not all that high compared to the recent past, but is still there. So for Australia, exports of coal are a really big deal, as coming from Queensland you would no doubt appreciate. Exports are more than $40 billion a year and an enormously important part of the Australian economy. So why are those exports growing as fast as they are? For that you need to turn to the picture of world coal demand. This chart is in a couple of parts, and for the moment just focus on this bit here, the black bars, which is a chart of world coal demand over the past 30 years or so. Now, as you can see, sort of slow and steady increase in the 1980s and 1990s. From about 2000 onwards, world coal demand has shot up. World coal demand over the period from those last 10 years has been increasing at a rate that means that half of the growth in all world energy consumption has been from coal. Driven largely by China, but not just from China. And what it means is that the growth in the demand for coal has dwarfed the growth in demand for any other energy source you can name. So coal at a worldwide scale is growing enormously strongly. And that's contributing to the fact that today coal accounts for nearly 30%, about 28% of global energy supply, and accounts for about 40% of electricity generation worldwide. So even accounting for the fact that in some countries coal doesn't play much of a part, worldwide it's enormously important as a fuel. And that's based on the very large reserves of coal that exist around the world. Worldwide, there's about 1 trillion tonnes of recoverable coal reserves. Australia's got about 10% of that world total, and that's enough to keep coal consumption going at its current rate for well over 100 years into the future. There's more coal than you can possibly think of using in the near future, and in some places people have stopped exploring for coal. There's more there, they just haven't bothered trying to find it because there's more than enough. So there's a lot of coal. There's particularly a large amount of coal in places like China and India, which is why they're using so much coal. And at the moment, they intend to continue using that coal into the future because their imperative is to increase living standards. They're drawing on domestic resources to do that, and that's why you get this enormous growth in coal demand. But the other part of the chart is talking about the future and is drawing on the International Energy Agency's scenarios for future energy use. The top line, the current policy scenario, is assuming that we continue at the rate that we are with the policies that governments have put in place today starting to take effect. So things like Australia's carbon tax factored into that. Things like the European emissions trading scheme factored into that. No new policies, just current policies. So on current policies around the world, coal demand will continue to increase quite strongly into the future, driven again by China and to a lesser extent India. But not just China and India, there's other countries in the mix as well. The new policy scenario says, okay, what if we also factor in all of the commitments that governments have made, no matter how vague, no matter whether they're actually backed up by action or not, but if you take into account all of the promises that governments have made to do something, the new policy scenario is the result. And as you can see, what that shows basically is that coal continues to grow for the next few years, then levels off. But under current promises, vague policies, pie-in-the-sky ideas that governments have actually come out with at the moment, there's no reduction in coal demand into the foreseeable future. What is required in order to meet the kind of emission reduction targets that global governments are talking about, that is limiting temperature increases to about 2 degrees centigrade, is a drastic reduction in fossil fuel use, including coal use, and that's where this 450 scenario comes into effect. And as you can see, that would require very large reductions in coal demand compared to where we are now, again largely driven by action in China and India, but it would only amount to coal demand falling back to about the levels of the early 2000s. So even under a scenario where there is very strong action taken to address climate change, and even under a scenario where we're taking very ambitious action to limit increases in temperatures to about 2 degrees Celsius, there's still room for coal in the mix. Note that the scale here means that there's a bit of demand down here, so there's a fair bit of coal production and demand still happening. So, how can that be the case? How can you still achieve your climate goals by having large amounts of coal still in the mix, even though substantially less than at present? The answer is the technology mix that you need to address climate change. So this chart, again drawing on the IEA's analysis, shows that compared with that new policy scenario, which in itself is a fairly ambitious scenario, in order to meet that 450 scenario, in order to get your temperature change under control within the next 20 years or so, what is required basically is a mix of everything you can throw at the problem. And that's essentially what the international modelling from bodies like the International Energy Agency, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is showing. You can't achieve these kind of outcomes by any single technology or any single kind of action. So you need a very large contribution from energy efficiency. You need a very large contribution from renewables. Under their scenarios, you need a very large contribution from nuclear. All of those things still won't get you to the kinds of emission reduction targets that we're talking about, which is where carbon capture and storage comes in. Carbon capture and storage can make a very large contribution to meeting those climate goals because carbon capture and storage is the only technology that enables you to significantly reduce emissions from fossil fuels at a large scale. And that's the point of CCS. The only reason you do CCS is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but if you do CCS, it can make a very substantial contribution to reducing emissions. Without CCS in the mix, what happens is either you can't meet the goals, you can't meet the targets, or the cost of doing so is enormously increased for the kinds of reasons that Peter talked about, the cost of some of these alternatives, and I'll come back to that in a little while. So, you get a similar picture in Australia. This is an enormously complicated picture, but don't worry too much about it. This is drawn from Australian Treasury modelling of what happens to the Australian energy mix in a couple of different scenarios when you start to impose much higher carbon prices than the government is currently contemplating on the Australian economy. And Treasury have made it easy for us because the black bit is coal. So if you look at the black bit, what you'll see is that under any of these scenarios, really, you start to see a significant reduction in coal use towards the middle of the century. Again, because the carbon constraint, the carbon prices are starting to get higher and higher, and something has to be done about it. But the point about this slide is that that's a slightly misleading picture in itself, because what starts to happen under all of these scenarios is that you start to get CCS imposed. The carbon prices are such that you can start to bring on carbon capture and storage as the most efficient way of helping to meet these different emission constraints. You get very large contributions from renewables, no denying that, but you need carbon capture and storage to start coming on stream as well. In a lot of these scenarios, the CCS is applied to gas, even more so than coal, because again, carbon capture and storage is applicable to fossil fuels, not just coal. But regardless of whether you're talking about the world picture or the Australian picture, CCS plays a part in meeting significant emission reduction constraints. So, what is CCS for people who aren't familiar with the technology? Essentially, CCS is a technology that involves separating carbon dioxide from the exhaust gas streams of large stationary sources of emissions. Whether you're talking about power stations, iron and steel plants, cement processing plants, fertiliser plants, natural gas processing plants, they're all large stationary sources of CO2. And carbon capture and storage starts with the capture bit, starts with separating that CO2 from the flue gas streams or the emission streams. You need to then process the CO2, and in particular to compress it into a very dense fluid, transport it by pipeline to a suitable storage site and pump it very deep underground. We're talking more than 1 kilometre underground, well below any aquifers, any potable drinking water, and basically keeping it there for a very long time, because you've got impermeable seals above where you're putting the CO2, so it can't leak out. As I said, the technology is applicable to any large stationary source, and while there's been a bit of a focus on electricity generation in what I've been talking about and what others will talk about, another important point to make is that for some of the other industrial sources of CO2, like iron and steel or cement, which involve the production of CO2 as part of the production process, there's no alternative. You've got to produce CO2 in the production process of those materials. If you want to keep on making cement, you produce CO2. You've got to deal with that CO2 somehow. It's currently the only way we know of dealing with that CO2 is through CCS. So why don't we do CCS much at the moment? As Peter indicated, it's because of cost. It's a costly technology. You're adding things to existing power plants or adding things to existing industrial plants. And it's the capture bit of the technology that's a really expensive bit. Separating the CO2 from flue gases is expensive. So what this shows is that compared with some renewable energy technologies like geothermal, hydropower and onshore wind, CCS is quite expensive. You can't really do it for significantly less than around $50 a tonne, and you're really talking about $100 a tonne before CCS really comes into its own. But the point is, it is still significantly cheaper than some of the other technologies, in particular some of the renewable technologies that you're going to have to rely on as those emission constraints bite harder and harder in the future. So CCS is not the first thing you would do, but ultimately it has to be part of the mix, both because of the scale of the problem involved and because it makes sense from an economic point of view compared to some of the alternatives that are on offer that we know about today. So finally, what is happening with CCS at the moment? The point I want to emphasise is that CCS is happening today around the world at large scale. There are pilot plants and small-scale demonstrations in a number of different places, but there are currently 8 large-scale projects operating in North America, in Europe and in North Africa. And those 8 large-scale projects are capturing and storing more than 20 million tonnes a year of CO2 already, pumping them underground and keeping it there. There's 7 more of these plants under construction, which will bring the total to about 35 million tonnes a year once those plants are built in the next couple of years. And importantly, 2 of those plants are in the electricity generation sector. There's a coal-fired power plant in Canada and a coal-fired power plant in the United States, which involve full-scale CCS under construction today. And there's a lot more in the planning process, which have the potential to really start to ramp this technology up in the coming decade. But while the IEA and others say that CCS remains critical in the long term, what's also clear is that the number of projects that are going ahead today is nowhere near enough. So compared to those kinds of numbers, the IEA is talking about the need for 3,400 large-scale CCS plants by the middle of the century. A very long way to go to reach those kind of targets, but that's the magnitude of the task ahead of us if we want to meet those emission reduction targets that governments are seriously talking about. So thank you.
Now for the scary bit. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to do this, so thank you, Chris, for inviting me to be here. But I'm especially pleased to have 2 of my colleagues from all those years ago here as well, shoved away in that little back room at the back of the chemistry building. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you briefly about the question that I'm asking tonight about this issue. And it's really simply, should we add fission energy to the mix? And that, of course, would manifest itself as nuclear power generation. Well, the time's short and the subject's important, so let me begin. And the first thing I should do, I guess, is tell you where I'm coming from in all of this. It seems the critical issue is, do you believe this climate change stuff or not? And if you do, what are we going to do about it in any way that is effective in time? Or do you not believe it? Now, I'm not a zealot, but I'm not a denier either. I've spent a fair bit of time studying all this. I've come a long way in my journey of coming around to the idea that I think nuclear power generation is something we ought to look at and seriously assess. So let me just quickly run through these things. This is me. Overloading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases is not a good idea. You can argue about it. Is it going to be benign? Is it going to be a moderate effect? Is it going to be catastrophic? They're all out there. Take your pick. But actually, a lot of it's just opinion and what people want to believe rather than what they need to know. Fossil fuels will underpin our way of life for a long while. You've heard that from the other speakers. The trouble with carbon taxes and so on, in principle, are good perhaps, but until there are alternatives at the right price, easily available, reliable, always available when we want them, fossil fuels are going to be with us. It's a global problem. Acting alone makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but it doesn't do anything, unless everybody does it. Greenhouse gases are well-mixed gases. What you do tomorrow affects the world within a few weeks, and vice versa. So we've got to get this as a global issue rather than I'll do my bit and I'm satisfied. It doesn't work that way. We're a small contributor at home, as you've heard many times, 1.4%, not much. But the United Kingdom's only 1.5, Canada's 1.7. So we're down there. It's the United States, China, and the European Union equals 50%. So we need to do it everywhere. Now, if you're convinced of the risk that we're taking with the atmosphere, changing its composition as we are, then you'll be convinced perhaps that we need to really think about what we ought to do, and that's all I'm suggesting tonight. And because of those characteristics, if you're going to make a big change, you need to take big action. It's really, unfortunately, as simple as that. Electricity generation and transport are, of course, the places to look. I thought I would take you through a little analysis done by a gentleman called Martin Nicholson, a Cambridge graduate in mathematics and electrical engineering and so on, lives in Australia. And he's analysed the TREASURY modelling that Barry referred to. And it reveals some interesting points, which I think are a little troubling, certainly to me. The government has set big GHG greenhouse gas reductions, 80% above our 2000 year levels by 2050, and 5% below 2000 level in 2020. It doesn't sound like much, but actually it's a 160 million tonne reduction. That's 7.5 years from now. And by 2050, which is only 37.5 years away, we're supposed to reduce our current emissions by 903 million tonnes a year. Our emissions in 2010 were 578 tonnes, totally, completely. So it's a big ask, as they say in rugby league. The problem is that the only way we can do this, according to the Treasury modelling, which underpinned the formation of the carbon tax, is by buying overseas credits. Now, they don't highlight that terribly much, but that's a fact. And the only way you can get down to those levels by 2050 is to buy 9,100 million tonnes of foreign offset credits. And that's expected to cost us, this is Treasury modelling, I'm not making this up, $716,000 million over that 38-year period in 2010 dollars. So very quickly and very simply, what it really means is that by 2050 we're still going to have 53% of our electricity generation from fossil fuels, even after the modelling has assumed that there'll be 47% from renewables, as Barry was referring to. But that includes, and I don't want to be rude, but I call it heroic, and heroic expansion of enhanced geothermal and a significant application of carbon capture and storage, as Barry has alluded to. And I ask myself, is that the best we can do in Australia? Do we really think that's the best way out of this, to buy 80% of those emissions to such an extent by foreign offset credits, paying somebody in Russia not to cut down their birch trees? And please be honest, tell us. It's not about energy, in my view, and I think this is a point that is worth making. We use the words interchangeably, and that's fine. Everybody knows what you mean. But actually, energy comes in various forms, most of it from the sun, in various forms, wind and solar and so on, as we know, fossil fuels, etc. But what we really want is power. We want to be able to turn that switch on and know that the light's going to go on. When you come up in the lift, you want to be sure that the lift's going to get there. So it's power, the conversion of energy from one form into another. I'm not going to make this a lecture, but you know about all this stuff, I'm sure. But really we should remember, in talking about renewables and various things that can be done and assumed and whatever, just ask yourself, do they meet these 5 criteria? It's already been alluded to by Peter. Energy density, and we know fossil fuels, gasoline and so on are very dense. Power density though, how many watts per square metre do you need? A nuclear power plant, let's say, occupies 100 hectares. That's 1 square kilometre. To get the equivalent, reliable production, generation of electricity from a wind array, you would need 50,000 hectares of land. And you'd need 12,000 hectares of solar array to get the same generated electricity outcome. So that's what's meant by power density. Scale, the biggest challenge of all. The scale of the existing fossil fuel era in which we've all lived and rely on is so great that we really just don't appreciate it. Changing it's going to be extremely difficult, as Peter talked about, cents per kilowatt hour. But always remember, when people are talking to you about cents per kilowatt hour, especially for renewables, ask them, does that include the cost of the backup? The sun doesn't shine at night. Does that cost include the cost of storage or the gas plant, which is actually just out there at the back in case the sun doesn't shine? And emissions intensity, of course, greenhouse gas per kilowatt hour. Full life cycle analysis, you don't hear people talk about that much either. And it needs to be applied to everything. Nuclear, fossil fuels, anything. And you'd be surprised at what the answers are. Just because it's renewable doesn't mean it's always the best. Doesn't mean it's always free. Look at the whole job from one end to the other before you can make any sensible judgment. I just show a couple of numbers there. These are by Professor McKay at Cambridge University, but it just shows you, without trying to beat any drums, there's a huge difference. Peter talked about the corn crop in America. That's quite true. But its power density is only 0.02 watts per square metre. For nuclear power, it's 1,000. So these are differences that people really need to understand before major decisions are made. So the end result, whether we know it or whether we like it or not, is that the TREASURY modelling, this is government modelling, shows that we can't do it, even with the renewables, the enhanced geothermal, the gas, carbon capture and storage, all of which have been mentioned. They can't do the whole of the electric power job in Australia without us buying all those foreign credits from somebody overseas so that we can say we've done it. And all that money leaves, goes offshore, and we'll never see it again. We don't get anything back, we don't get new cars, we don't get anything for it, it's all gone. I don't think we should stop there. I think we should think a bit harder than that. Okay, well, let me move on quickly. For and against nuclear power, everyone has got arguments about it, and I'm not going to try and convince you one way or the other. But I think all I can ask for is for people to take a harder look and to look for some accurate facts, not what we all thought was the case yesterday or 20, 30, 40 years ago. But just very quickly, you know, you can impress everybody with these sorts of things, but it is a fact that 20 million times more energy is released in the fission of one nuclear atom versus the combustion of one natural gas molecule and so on. There's no GHG produced in operation at all. Small quantity of waste, 27 tonnes a year from a light water reactor, plus some mixed material, which I'll come to in a minute, versus 300,000 to 400,000 tonnes of ash from a coal-fired power station of 1 gigawatt. And there's a fair bit of radioactivity in it, actually. There's more radioactivity in that than there is in a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant. But anyway, that's another story. The high online reliability, 90% plus, mostly 93%. And the directions are in, as I've shown there, for lower cost and so on, but all of that is in the future. I'll talk about it in a minute. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, as I call them, everybody wants to know, and rightly so. How do these things get handled? The cost, the safety, the waste, and the proliferation. And rightly so, and I'll touch on those in a minute. And the three gorillas in the room, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. I'll come to those briefly, quickly. Is it too late? Too little, too late for any real reduction? And we've heard about time limits and so on. Well, it's an open question, and all I can say is the old Irish joke, well, if you want to get to Dunleary, the only place you can start from is here. And that's what we ought to do. And I think we've been asleep at the wheel in Australia in thinking harder about this. We're just leaving it up to the government, and everybody talks about renewables. Nothing wrong with renewables. They find their place, though, through proper analysis, is my view. Safety, very quickly, 3 Mile Island, each one of those things was specific, explainable. 3 Mile Island, operator error, an indicator light didn't work properly, he thought the valve was shut and it wasn't, etc., etc., etc. There was no body killed, nobody injured, and there was a very small leak of radiation. Despite that, Jane Fonda made the movie China Syndrome, and of course everybody thinks nuclear power is the worst in the world. It's not. Chernobyl, yes, very bad news, 1986, Russian design, very poor design, no containment building at all. And again, unauthorised action by the operators to make a test, and you probably know the rest. Strangely enough, only 134 people died. And that's a World Health Organisation study, not me. But there were 6,000 cases of children getting iodide poisoning, which could have easily been overcome if the government had distributed those tablets quickly. but they didn't. The rest is history, as we know. Fukushima, if that tsunami had not occurred, you probably would never have heard of it. It was a tsunami, first and foremost. That wiped out and killed 20,000 people. But I guarantee you never hear about that now, do you? All you hear about is the nuclear accident. 14 feet of water, travelling at 100 kilometres an hour. Yes, old design, 50-year-old design, and the pumps are in the vulnerable position. Bad news, but that's all. Those three. Only 2 men died. One man had a heart attack, the other one fell off a ladder. And the World Health Organization at the moment is not showing a heck of a lot of problems with other people. The worst feature, actually, of the Chernobyl accident was 200,000 abortions. I'll leave the rest there. You can read that at some other time. But suffice to say that the design rigour that goes into the design of a nuclear power plant is enormous, and it is getting tighter and tighter. The regulator in the US now requires a probabilistic risk analysis showing that there'll be no more than one significant event in 1 million reactor years. The world now has 14,500 reactor years of operation. This is actual. It's not promise. It's not maybe. This is real. It's been in place for 50 years. 14,500 reactor years in 31 countries, and the US Navy has been using them for 5,700 reactor years without a single significant experience, I should say. So, it's the perception that counts. I know that. I can talk about the facts all night. It's your perception and others that count, and we must respect that. But I just hope that people think about it, and perhaps we can start to have a decent discussion about it someday. Moving quickly through the rest of this, just some numbers about cost. Peter showed you some numbers about cost, so did Barry. Did you notice where nuclear was? It wasn't up the top end, was it? There's a lot of history about this to do with delay, legal challenges, regulatory requirements in the United States, and so on. That's what we've all got in our mind. That's what the picture, that's what we saw on the movie screen. It's all bad news. Well, it isn't. And it's time, I think, that all of us, me included, took a fresh look at this and looked at some real numbers. And these come from the US Energy Information Service, which I think Peter quoted as well. So you'll see some surprises if you look at it. Some recent examples, they always talk about, oh, it's terribly expensive and so on. Well, maybe not. The South Koreans are building 3 1-gigawatt plants in the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. They're sitting on all that gas and all that oil. But they're starting to move into nuclear power because they're thinking a bit more long-term than perhaps we are. The South Koreans have given them a fixed price contract, fixed period, 4 years, start to finish. $3,600 US dollars per installed kilowatt, and so on. You can read the rest. China is 1,700, of course, as you might expect. The USA, they're starting their renewable, their renaissance now of nuclear power, 5,400. That includes years of delay and pre-construction expense, but they are now moving ahead with another nuclear plant of just over 2 gigawatts. Interestingly enough, GE is putting what they call their power reactor innovative small module into the UK. They've offered it to the UK for nothing. And all they'll take in return is the revenue they'll get from electricity generation and for burning some of the plutonium, which has been separated, from previous work and needs to be dealt with. But the important thing is that these levelised cost reductions that Peter referred to, nuclear comes out okay if you take a fair look at it over the 60-year life of a typical nuclear plant. Yes, it's high up front, but the actual cost of the fuel amounts to 0.2 to 0.5 of a cent per kilowatt hour, that's all. 180 tonnes of fuel a year for a light water reactor for 1 gigawatt. And in the case of a 1 gigawatt coal-fired plant, you're looking at 3-4 million tonnes of coal a year. So these are big differences, and if we're concerned about where all this might be taking us, we should perhaps start to think about it and ask a few questions. Waste is a problem. We all are worried about that. There are two types, the fission products, which actually have half-lives. Some of them only last seconds, 23 minutes, 10 seconds. Some last up to 300 years. Actinides, which are the heavies, the plutonium and neptunium and curium and so on. Of course, they're the ones you always hear about that last forever and so on. The half-life of uranium-238 is 4,500 million years. It goes back to the beginning of the Earth. But because of that, it's low radioactivity. The trouble is, you hold it in your hand, the trouble is that it's very slow to go away. So we have got to do something with it, and rightly so. So there's a lot of misconception. I had it too, but I've changed my mind, and I want to know more. There's some storage, some reactor fuel in the world, which is a problem, which has been out there because of weapons, and that's one of the problems. The very words nuclear power bring with them that awful image that we've all seen of the atom bomb and what it did. But that's all. Haven't been any since. And we need to get realistic about what we can do to harness that kind of energy in a controlled and very, very safe and sensible way. It has been said that there's more energy in the United States, 10 times more energy in the depleted uranium and spent fuel that the United States has got than is in their current coal reserves. Perhaps, as I say, that's the real waste. Okay, just quickly, proliferation. 8 out of 207 have nuclear weapons, maybe one extra if you count Israel. And it's simply, I think, necessary to make the point that whatever we do is not going to change that. So we can be upset about it, we can talk about it, we can get agitated about it, but frankly, what we do, whether we adopt nuclear power generation or not, and I'm not talking about nuclear weapons at all, of course, then it's not going to make any great difference. There's a bit there about plutonium. If you want to get this from Chris later and so on, he'll talk a bit more about it, but it's very important. People think you need a nuclear reactor to make a bomb. You don't. All you need is a whole lot of very flash centrifuges, as we've seen in Iran. Where that goes, who knows? My bet is that it's going to be stopped one way or the other. People talk about terrorism, rightly so, it's a worry. But boy, those blokes must be pretty smart if they can build a successful nuclear weapon without wiping themselves out in the process. An interesting point, which I wasn't aware of, the Russians and the Americans have come to an agreement. They've eliminated a lot of their warheads, 12,000 so far. And surprisingly enough, 50% of the nuclear power that's now being used in the United States is coming from those warheads. Russian, what were Russian weapons. But all that, of course, must stand aside from this issue. What's ahead? You can read about this later. It's something called the integral fast reactor. Instead of slowing the neutrons down, you keep them at a high level, high energy level, and they're allowed to travel very fast, and they produce a lot of power. And there's a very clever design using a liquid sodium coolant and so on, atmospheric pressure, simple componentry, you reprocess it on site, and so on. It's extremely interesting, but I haven't got time to talk about it a lot here. But it only takes 1 tonne a year of fuel, that's all. And you get 1,000 megawatts of power, the same as you'd get from a coal plant that chews up 4 million tonnes of coal. You still need repositories for what's left, which is the 300-year stuff. It's a very, very clever designed and developed in the US, but stopped by our old mate Bill Clinton for pure political reasons. But they're now trying to resurrect it. Meanwhile, of course, China and Russia have built them and are starting to use them. Liquid thorium, you've probably heard about that. There's a lot more thorium in the world than there is uranium. It is difficult to use, though, in some respects, and so on. But India is very keen on thorium, and who knows, in the future it might become more used for power generation as time goes by. And it's definitely not suitable for weapons. No point in mucking around trying to make a weapon out of that stuff. Small and medium reactors is very important. They're now talking about small and medium reactors, 50, 20, 30, 300. The big problem with nuclear power is the upfront expense. This might be one way around it. You start with a 300 megawatt reactor and you add to it and share the infrastructure and the security cost and so on and so on. These things are all possible. And I ask myself sometimes, how much do we know about this in Australia? And I know the answer, unfortunately. Let's move, finally, almost there. Australia is one of the most carbon-dependent nations on Earth. You're probably asking, well, that's all very well, but why should we do it? Now, Peter had a view, and a very proper one too, about, well, technology will evolve and so on, and I'm sure it will, and I hope he's right. It all depends on whether you believe we need to do something about it now, before it's too late, or not, really. But continuing to put 35,000 million tonnes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere each year, I personally don't think is a good idea, to be honest. And it goes up at 2 parts per million each year. So all I'm asking is we should assess all of the alternatives in Australia, all of the low carbon options, not just leave nuclear off the table. If you read the government stuff that came out about all this stuff, the word nuclear got, I think it was a paragraph about that big. But it was very interesting, and they said, oh yeah, well it's too hard and we won't look at it now. But it was very interesting that Martin Ferguson, the minister, when he released the government's view on the White Energy paper, he said, well, yeah, but if all these renewable and other options don't work, we might have to come back and look at nuclear. So they know it's there. The trouble is, time goes by, and are we losing our place? The last thing I want to show you is then the result of what Martin Nicholson did with his analysis of the TREASURY modelling. This is not a theoretical exercise. This is what it would show. And all I've done is say, okay, should we think in a portfolio term? Renewables, yes, to the point where they're effective, economic, environmentally acceptable. Then, excuse me, a baseload option, where again you've got gas and gas plus CCS and so on, all of which play their part. But as he points out, with that result that I talked about earlier, you could afford to build 25 nuclear power plants instead of paying the man in Russia to promise not to cut down his trees. And all I've done is taken his numbers and converted them into an emission intensity to show how that would change over that period. And if you look down the bottom, the number of nuclear plants that we'd need, 5 by 2025 and so on, and that would get you that result. The IPCC, whether you like them or not, and there's plenty of things you can criticise about it, but this is what they are talking about, avoiding that +2 degree limit that we've talked about, 450 ppm, 550 by the end of the century. Right now the world average is 800, or sorry, ours is 800. The world requirement at the moment is about 500. They said we should be below 300 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour by 2030, and we should be below, the world, should be below 50 by 2050 if we are serious about trying to avoid that result, because we're worried that it might be bad, very bad. As a matter of interest, France, right now, is at 83. They're already almost there because they get 80% of their electricity requirement from nuclear energy. Okay, conclusion, there's no panacea or quick fix. Everybody will tell you that. It's a global issue. It's going to be around for a long while. CO2 lasts for 100 years, as you know, in the atmosphere. And it's bedeviled by uncertainty, which is another thing you don't hear much about. People don't talk much about it, but there is a lot of uncertainty. But there's also a lot of things we now know, and I think we need to untangle them. But that's another subject. I think a no regrets policy would be smart for us. Maybe we could ignore it, hope the renewables can do it all, but I wouldn't put my money on it. So it goes on here. We've got no option if we don't do anything other than what the Treasury modelling said we could do, the maximum we could do with renewables. We'll have no option but to rely on those foreign credits. Nothing real and verifiable but a letter from some bloke saying he didn't cut his trees down. Do you reckon the rest of the world's going to accept that as fair income, as Mrs. Gillard likes to call it? So all I've said at the end here is, look, because it appears to be competitive on a levelised cost basis, and you can examine any amount of those numbers you like, by comparison with other low carbon technologies, and because of its enormous power potential. We want the lights at the middle of the night, not just when the sun shines. And its proven record of performance over 50 years. It's already being used in 31 countries, and many other countries are doing the same thing. I think we should have nuclear power generation on the table, that's all, for a serious assessment in Australia.
Okay, so three very different perspectives. I'll just quickly summarise. So from Peter, I think what we heard was, what should the policy be if we're going to transition? His view is we can't afford to shift out of fossil fuels prematurely because it's too expensive. And so what we need to do is look at adaptation measures and transitioning through a lower intensity fossil fuel like natural gas. And that'll be the most competitive outcome. Barry pointed out that whatever scenario we look at, the world's going to burn a lot more coal between now and 2050, and so we just can't not have CCS. So under every scenario, the most optimistic scenario, we're burning the same amount of coal globally as we were in 2000. That's the most optimistic. Every reasonable scenario sees us increasing coal consumption. He points out that we're burying 20 million tonnes of CO2 today, but I notice in the chart we've got to bury 3,500 million tonnes per annum by 2050, so that's the size of the challenge. And that's what Barry really pointed out to us, was the size of the challenge we're facing here is enormous. If we look at 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, which is what we've decided is the target in Australia, current policy just won't do it, and I agree with him. So we had a response in the white paper very similar. How can we expect to spend $1 trillion buying overseas credit and just park the problem in someone else's yard? This is just not on. So we do have to look at alternatives, and we do have to look harder. So I think everyone understands that there's a portfolio here that's going to be necessary. It's going to include renewables, no question. Highly unlikely scenario that we will get to a point where it's 100% renewables. And so we're going to need a mix of all of these options, including nuclear. So I'm not going to say any more. I would like to open it up for questions, and I think raise your hand, and someone's carrying a microphone. Questions? Surely. Just in front. We'll get a microphone if you don't mind.
In the cost of the nuclear power plants, is decommissioning included in that?
Yes.
It is.
Yes. Yes, in fact,
yes. Barry, I'll get you to stand up. When you,
yeah. Is that working? Is that right? Yes, I believe there is a small levy built in to the operation of the plants in America that actually do that. Peter might know better than I do, to cover that. But I would have to say, to my knowledge, no nuclear plant has ever been fully and completely decommissioned. One or two have been shut down, but as I understand it, they haven't gone through the whole rigmarole yet. But it is covered in the numbers, yes.
Question at the back.
I've got a question for Barry. Barry, I'm not an expert in CCS or
what is Middle Barry.
Yeah, Middle Barry there. I don't know much about it, but I've got one concerning question in regards to disasters. Because you're burying all those gas under the crust of the earth. So, and you're putting it beside plants which are located all over the, globe. Like United States, which is, in some locations very prone to earthquake. I don't know what else we've got, what else disasters we've got. So what sort of a disaster recovery and what sort of a costing do we have for these things?
Good question. There's a bit of a misperception, I think, about how the gas is stored underground. So we're not talking about putting carbon dioxide into caverns, into big spaces underground. What we're talking about is basically, if you think of sandstone, if you think of sandstone rock, you think of just pouring water on that rock, it just gets absorbed. That's what carbon dioxide does. It goes into the tiny, tiny pore spaces in rock, spreads out through those pore spaces in the rock, and is in a very stable formation in that rock. So the disaster scenario of enormous amounts of carbon dioxide booming out from under the ground cannot happen, basically because it's not stored that way. It's not stored in large pools of gas. It's stored in tiny quantities in little pore spaces in a large extent of rock. Can it leak? Under some circumstances it could leak, but all of the studies show that the most likely leakage scenario is through wells that have already been drilled in the ground. So what you need to take care about is that all of the old oil and gas wells are properly plugged, are properly sealed, so that there's no leakage back out from there. The likelihood of leakage from just coming up through the ground is extremely low. If the carbon dioxide did come up that way, the major problem is it's going back into the atmosphere. It's not what it would do to anything on the surface, it's the fact that it goes back into the atmosphere gradually and very gradually. So there has been some work done, and we've published some work very recently looking at damage estimates, basically. What is the cost of all of these things going wrong? And the conclusion of that study is the likelihood of a lot of things going wrong is pretty low. In the big scheme of things, you can manage most of those risks properly. In the unlikely event that something does actually go wrong, the damage costs are not particularly high. So again, the major problem is the CO2 gets back into the atmosphere. That's what you're trying to avoid in the first place, so it's what you're trying to stop from happening. But the likelihood of any other disasters is extremely low.
I can probably add to that, having worked in the field as well. Most of the CO2 injection sites are actually in saline water. So those sandstone reservoirs Barry talks about, they're actually saturated with salt water. So when the CO2 goes in, first of all, it's in small droplet form dispersed in that sandstone amongst the water. Eventually it dissolves and ultimately it forms into cementation type products to be permanently stored. So if you measure it in years and decades, you actually have very little chance of it ever escaping because it's actually in solid form. In the early times you do, but typically you would never look at injecting CO2 near a fault line. But you actually do the geological work to understand where the location should be. So you just can't and you don't store it anywhere. It's selected locations.
Yes, for the CCS speaker, how many or what proportion of sites, for example, power stations, cement plants and so on, have suitable underground storage reasonably accessible to the plant?
I don't know, is the honest answer. A lot more work does need to be done on storage characterisation, on trying to figure out where the best storage locations are around the world. Some very high-level estimates have been done about the total amount of storage that's available, and it's in the trillions of tonnes. There's more than enough capacity underground around the place to store the CO2 that we might realistically look at putting underground over the coming decades. As you point out, the problem is proximity. The problem is not all of those good storage locations are near where your sources are. So we are going to have to talk about transportation over fairly long distances through pipelines and through ships to get the CO2 to where it needs to go, at least in the medium term. And there are currently thousands of kilometres of CO2 pipelines in the United States operating today. So it is possible to transport CO2 over long distances. It is being done today. adds a bit of cost the longer you have to go. So ultimately, what we do need to do is prove up a lot of storage capacity and, again, ultimately perhaps look at locating the sources a little bit closer to those sinks. So, for example, as power stations reach the end of their economic life, you think about where to locate the next batch of power stations. It might not be where you're building them today. So there's different things you can do on the source sink matching, but a lot more work does have to be done on that aspect.
So another question, just
approximately how much extra energy do you have to generate to clean up the flue gases and compress them sufficiently to pump them underground?
Quite a bit. There is a substantial energy penalty. The energy penalty is mostly in the capture component, but also, as you say, in the compression component. And you are talking about energy penalties of the order of 40–50% in some cases. So you do have to burn more fossil fuel in order to deal with the emissions from the fossil fuel burning. A lot of research and development effort is going into reducing that energy penalty, looking at more efficient ways of stripping the CO2 out of the flue gas, for example. It's a major dilemma that the industry has to face, but it's something that's acknowledged. Again, the reason you do CCS is to reduce CO2 emissions, and there are costs, including energy penalty costs, in doing that. And that's where a lot of the research effort is going into reducing that energy penalty. But at the end of the day, yes, you do have to expend extra power in order to do that. Some clever people are talking about combining renewable energy with fossil fuels in order to deal with some of that energy penalty by using renewables to help the process as well. So there's imaginative ways you can combine energy sources in order to help deal with that problem too.
Just from a grassroots level, is it a good idea for individual households to put solar on their roofs?
from whose perspective?
Just individuals like us.
Yeah, so I think...
On our houses.
Well, does someone else want to answer it? I've got a view, but I'm moderating, I'm not.
Well, you know, what it might make sense for you to do as an individual depends, of course, in part on the subsidies, which someone else is paying. Does it make economic sense in the grand scheme of things to generate power that way at the moment? No, it doesn't. Not without a lot of technological improvement. But, you know, with generous enough subsidies, it can make sense to you personally, but someone else is paying the bill. And, you know, I guess, you know, part of what I was trying to say is, you know, these technologies, we're going to have technological change. You know, think about what energy technologies were like 100 years ago. The notion that we're going to have the same energy technologies for the next 100 years is just incredible. It's unbelievable. By the same token, you know, I'm not arguing that there's not reasons for subsidising research into these technologies. I think there are, and a lot of these alternatives we talked about. I'm arguing that penalising the use of fossil fuels right now is a very expensive, it's like a very expensive form of insurance. You know, so you can buy, think about fire insurance for your house. You can buy very expensive fire insurance that protects you against arson, let's say, only. The alternative I'm talking about is cheaper insurance that protects you against fire no matter what the cause, and at the same time throws in protection against breaking and entering and a few other things at the same time. So, you know, I'm talking about a cost-benefit analysis, not if there's anything, if these things are beneficial, but are they the most cost-effective way of handling the problem? And so from the grand scheme of things, solar on your roof, no. But from a personal point of view, if there's a big enough subsidy, yes.
And in Australia, it makes sense for you, if you've got the capital to invest, to do it, but it's going to raise electricity prices overall for others. And I think that's been well documented in the press and elsewhere recently. So,
thanks very much for producing those wonderful numbers tonight. I didn't really appreciate how many overseas permits that we needed to buy, and it's quite frightening. About 6 months ago, I made a decision to actually buy mining company shares that produced uranium because I had a view probably similar to you. So, thank you very much. But I've actually got a question for Barry Jones. I've sort of been in and out of renewable energy and low emissions technology game for about the last decade. What's the current state of R&D work being done in Australia with regard to sequestration? I understand the Queensland Government was going to issue tenements for CO2 sequestration, which have been sort of on the books for quite a while, and there's been sort of one minor project, the Otway project. So in terms of Australia really getting ahead of the game and sort of the magnitude of the problem that the other Barry spoke about, I'd like to sort of understand from your view where the Australian government's policy and direction is going.
Sure. Australia is still up with the game, I'd have to say. So you mentioned the CO2, the Otway project in Victoria, which is a storage project, basically to demonstrate the validity of storage as an option and to monitor what happens to the CO2 underground to make sure that it stays underground. So that's a world-class storage research effort that's underway. Here in Queensland, you might have heard of the failures of projects like ZeroGen, and Chris can talk a lot more about that than me. But there's successes. So the Callide power station has recently turned on or commissioned one of their oxy-fuel boilers, with starting to demonstrate the process of an alternative way of generating electricity, of burning coal, which makes it a little bit easier in a way to separate out the CO2, and then the next step is to look at where the CO2 is going to go. You've got the Commonwealth Government putting money into projects in Western Australia, the Southwest Hub project near Collie, and in Victoria, the Carbon Net project in the Latrobe Valley, both of which are looking at industrial hubs, basically, of CO2 sources, dealing with the sources from multiple sources in those industrial agglomerations, and starting to look at the storage options that are available in those regions to eventually put the CO2 underground. The Commonwealth Government is certainly going out with exploration permits, starting to release acreage for CO2 storage, and the states are starting to get active in that game as well. So there is still a lot happening around Australia to start paving the way for CCS. Both the federal and the state governments are still putting money and effort into CCS. But I think it's also fair to say that they're also learning the lessons from what's happened elsewhere. A lot of the effort in Western Australia and in Victoria, for example, is going into looking at the storage options, making sure you've got storage first before you worry too much about the capture facilities. So there's effort going in at various levels and learning the lessons from what's happened elsewhere.
And we at UQ are in negotiations with the Commonwealth and the Australian Coal Association right now for a $40 million program to evaluate storage opportunities in Queensland. So yeah, no, there's still a particularly strong focus on storage, which I think is a good thing. You know, the idea of doing these big-scale integrated projects like ZeroGen was basically a flawed policy, too much high risk.
A comment and then a question, if I may. I've come from the point of view growing up that nuclear was a bad idea, but I'm come round now to feeling that it's probably the highest effect, lowest impact option we've got, and I would far prefer it to unconventional natural gas, because I think that's going to create far more problems than it solves, if any. Just a comment. Sellafield's never mentioned anymore in the accident profiles of nuclear power stations. But the question was about the solar panels again. If we don't encourage people to invest in them on their roofs and etc., won't there be a problem with encouraging people to continue funding research to get the technology to the stage where it is more effective and more affordable?
So I might just throw a comment in from my perspective first. I don't think anyone is saying we should forget about solar. I don't think anyone's saying we should stop the research. But what we're looking for is large-scale baseload solar power. So we need large-scale baseload plants, and we need rooftop solar. But the thing missing from the puzzle right now is energy storage. As somebody said, the sun don't shine at night. And if you live in Brisbane the week before last, the sun didn't shine at all. And so you've got to be able to handle these things. Now, my perspective is we are getting close, and by close I mean within a decade perhaps, of having a cost-effective storage, electrochemical storage, so these are batteries, for those intermittent things, but we're talking about 6 hours capacity. It doesn't get us through the night, and it certainly doesn't get us through a wet week. So, you know, yes, solar's important. It's a massive resource, the sun. We have to learn how to harvest it. But to do so, we have to be able to store electrochemical energy or some form of energy to be able to cope with the intermittency. Now,
thanks, Chris. Yes, I was just going to comment on Sellafield that you mentioned. You must come from there, do you?
No, I love it.
Okay. Yes, and Senator Conroy often mentions it as well. I think his father, excuse me, worked near there, and if people have had a bad experience, some radiation sickness or something, it becomes emotional very quickly, and I certainly don't tamper with that.
The microphone is not on.
Oh. The red light's showing. Is this thing working all right? No? Sorry. Sellafield, I think, was a reprocessing plant, and that's a no-no. The United States stopped reprocessing spent nuclear fuel years ago, 30 years ago. They will not allow it because it's a very complex, somewhat dangerous process, a lot of chemicals and so on. It's a very nasty business. To get the objective, of course, being back then to get pure plutonium for use in nuclear weapons, unfortunately. There was a leakage of radiation at Sellafield, which didn't do anyone much good. So these things have happened, and it's true. All I can do is talk about what I think was going to happen and what has happened with most of the other plants that have operated very successfully and calmly for all that period of time. And the new one, which I didn't have time to talk about, is the new stuff. I mean, the technology and the smarts behind that is pretty phenomenal. And the amount of waste that you get will be very small, because the heavy hitters, the plutonium and the actinides and the the Americans and Axiom and so on, are actually recycled and destroyed to extinction in this fast reactor. So you don't get them anymore. And the plutonium cannot be separated from the other elements that it comes out with. It's extremely clever chemistry, and it's really very interesting stuff. The idea of plutonium automatically being bad, and dangerous and used for weapons, therefore we must never use it. It's man-made, and we've created it, and it's not going to go away. It is extremely efficient in power production. So the idea is to stop it being used elsewhere, and that's what this new reactor, or these new reactors, which have been around, I must say, for 30 years, but no one wanted to know about them. Because the Americans were hooked on the light water reactor and so on and so forth. So it's a long and interesting story, but it's really interesting to understand why the Sellafields and others you should not see again.
Take one. I think we've got at least one more. Oh.
I was going to make a few comments on the question, if I could. So the first thing is I would say your question about how are we going to have these technologies be competitive? So what I would say is basically what we need is more R&D. So if you think about it, sort of subsidising output is a very indirect way of subsidising research. So what we should be doing is subsidising research into these alternative technologies directly to make them more cost competitive with the fossil fuels. So, and I think that there are many good economic arguments you can make for why we might want to have a policy of subsidising research into alternative energy technologies. But, it's like, I had a comment at one time that sort of subsidising output in order to subsidise research is like feeding flies by feeding horses hay. The other thing I want to say, make a comment about your unconventional gas. I mean, yes, there are some environmental issues associated with every form of energy production, actually. But you have to be very careful in reacting to some of the hype about unconventional gas. I've been to the unconventional gas fields in the United States, had a look for myself. The Gaslands movie, for example, showed pictures of natural gas, sort of water being set alight. And there was the gentleman who made the movie was at a conference in Chicago, and he was asked from the audience that did he know that there'd been natural gas in that water for many, many decades. In fact, the problem had been reported to the EPA, been there for many decades before there was any fracking and production of unconventional natural gas. And if he did know, didn't he think it was necessary to report it in the movie? And his reply was, yes, he did know, but it didn't fit with the story he wanted to tell. So you have to be careful and react to some of these things. The other thing I'd point out is, prior to unconventional natural gas, shale gas becoming a big issue in the United States, in fact, Greenpeace was a very big supporter of natural gas for the reason I mentioned. It's much less polluting than alternative forms of fossil fuel. And they were in the America's Natural Gas Alliance. But when unconventional gas was developed and natural gas prices dropped, it made all the renewables much less competitive as a form of electricity generation. And so the environmental movement has turned against natural gas. And a lot of the opposition to unconventional natural gas, I believe, is because a lot of the environmental movement believes that it's going to make it much harder to introduce renewables, which is what they want to see. The final point I say is the big thing with all of these things, hydraulic fracturing is not actually new. It's been used in the oil and gas industry for probably 50 years. And, you know, there are known issues with it. The main problem, as in any oil and gas production, the main issue really is to make sure you have good cementing jobs. You don't have casing failures. So,
So there was a question with the gentleman in the black shirt, and that's probably going to have to be the last question.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for letting me have the last word,
Peter.
maybe. I'm Peter Gresshoff, and I work at UQ, and I need to speak about the fact that there's a natural process of carbon capture, and that is a process of photosynthesis, and we all have benefited from that, and indeed the byproducts are food and oxygen, which are benefit and beauty. But more importantly, please recognize that it was photosynthesis that originally produced the coal and the natural gas, which we're all harvesting now. So I close with that.
Thank you. So,
Sorry.
One more.
Very, very quickly. Allows me to put in a plug for one more type of technology, which is bioenergy with CCS, which is a way of of actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. You lock it up through photosynthesis, burn the plants, capture the carbon from that burning, and it reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere.
And that is probably the only thing that is negative carbon. So, yeah, I agree. I think it's been an interesting perspective. I think the message we should take away is there is a place for renewables, there is a place for coal, there is a place for gas, there's a place, we think, for nuclear. I'll just talk a little bit about what University of Queensland's doing in this space. So we've established this University of Queensland Energy Initiative. It's a university-wide initiative that tries to capture and provide strategic direction to all of our energy research across the disciplines of engineering and science, but also social science, environmental science, economics, and legal and regulatory type policy. We do work in fossil fuels, mainly around coal and gas, very heavy emphasis on carbon capture and storage. We work in renewables, so we're very strong in solar energy and geothermal energy and biofuels. And then we also work in energy systems. So these are the enablers, things like batteries and energy storage systems, so that the intermittent renewables can become viable options for us. So we're working in all those spaces. We try to make it multidisciplinary, so we do worry about the social impacts of unconventional gas. We worry about this. We don't work in nuclear science, but we are working on policy, economics, and the social issues associated with nuclear energy in the future. So I'd just like to thank our speakers. They're all from southern states and or foreign countries, so we've got some fine Queensland wine for each one of them at the end of the table, and I'm sure they didn't know just how fine we could make wine, but we do. I'd also like to acknowledge the University of Queensland Central Advancement Office for helping to organise this, and the Engineering, Architecture and Information Technology faculty. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming and for participating and for listening to these three very interesting speakers, and I'd like you to join me in thanking them.